rigor mortis progression, establishing the time of death window. There's something almost poetic about how the body marks time after life has ended, not through clocks or calendars, but through a series of chemical and physical transformations that follow their own immutable rhythm. We've examined lividity and what blood pooling tells us about positioning and duration. Now we need to turn our attention to another silent timekeeper, one that speaks through the gradual stiffening of muscles, the progressive loss of flexibility that pathologists call rigor mortis. When investigators arrived at that house on the morning after Christmas, they would have noted the degree of rigidity in her small body. They would have tested the joints, assessed which muscle groups had stiffened and which remained pliable. And in doing so, they were reading a biological clock that had been ticking since the moment her heart stopped beating. This clock doesn't lie. It can't be reset or manipulated. It simply records the passage of time in the language of biochemistry. Let's establish what we're examining here, because rigor mortis operates according to principles that most people understand only vaguely. From a physiological standpoint, the stiffening begins when the body's ATP, adenosine triphosphate, the energy currency that powers every cellular function, becomes depleted after circulation ceases. Without fresh oxygen and nutrients being delivered, cells cannot produce new ATP. And without ATP, the microscopic filaments within muscle fibers that normally slide past each other to create movement become locked together. The muscles contract and stay contracted, creating the characteristic rigidity. This process follows a predictable sequence. It typically begins in the smaller muscle groups of the jaw and neck within 2 to 6 hours, progresses downward through the torso and arms over the next 4 to 6 hours, and reaches the larger muscles of the legs and feet last. Maximum rigidity is usually achieved within 12 hours, persists for another 12 to 24 hours, and then gradually releases as decomposition begins to break down the muscle proteins. The entire cycle, from onset to complete resolution, generally takes 36 to 48 hours, though various factors can accelerate or slow the process. Theme 1. The body schedule, what stiffening reveals about. When we think about rigor mortis in the context of this case, we're looking at evidence that operates like a biological timestamp. From a forensic perspective, the degree of rigidity documented when she was found allows us to calculate backward, to establish a window during which she was lost. And here's what makes this evidence so significant. It exists independent of what anyone in that house said or did. The muscles stiffened according to biochemical processes that began the moment circulation ceased and continued, regardless of human activity around the body. If we know what time she was discovered and examined, and we know the stage of rigor development at that examination, we can work backward through the predictable progression to estimate when the process began. This creates what forensic pathologists call a post-mortem interval, a window of time between the event and the discovery, and that window either aligns with the timeline that was reported or it doesn't. From a physiological standpoint, let's walk through what investigators would have been assessing. They would have tested the jaw, attempting to open and close it to gauge resistance. They would have checked the neck, the shoulders, the elbows, and wrists. Moving downward, they would have examined the fingers, looking for that characteristic curl that comes as the small muscles of the hand contract and stiffen. In the lower body, they would have tested the hips, knees, and ankles. And critically, they would have noted not just which areas showed rigidity, but the degree of that rigidity. Was it just beginning, creating mild resistance? Was it fully developed, making movement virtually impossible? Or had it begun to resolve, with the muscles starting to relax again as decomposition advanced? Each of these stages tells us something different about timing. Early rigor, localized primarily in the jaw and neck, suggests the event occurred within the previous few hours. Full rigor throughout the body suggests approximately 12 hours have passed. Resolving rigor suggests we're beyond the 24-hour mark. Now let's consider what this means psychologically for anyone who was in that house during those hours while rigor was developing. From a criminal mindset perspective, if someone was staging a scene, they would have been working against this biological clock. The body was getting stiffer with each passing hour, and that stiffening would eventually tell investigators approximately when she had been lost. If the staging required time to think, to plan, to create a believable narrative, to involve legal counsel, then every hour spent in those activities was an hour during which rigor was progressing. And here's the critical question. Did those responsible understand this? Did they know that the body's increasing rigidity would eventually contradict whatever timeline they constructed? Or were they so focused on other aspects of the staging that they failed to account for this most fundamental of biological processes? From an anthropological lens, we need to understand that rigor mortis has been recognized as a marker of time since ancient civilizations. Across cultures, across centuries, people who have dealt with the deceased have understood that bodies stiffen in the hours after life ends and eventually become flexible again. This knowledge is nearly universal. So when we think about educated adults, people with college degrees, people who read, people who had certainly encountered death before in their lives, we have to ask ourselves, did they understand what the body's stiffening would reveal? If they were staging a scene to suggest a later time of the incident than when it actually occurred, the rigor development would eventually expose that deception. The body would be too stiff or not stiff enough for the timeline being presented, and that discrepancy would be noted, measured, and documented by medical examiners who do this work every day. Let's shift to the logical implications. If we accept the timeline that was officially presented, that she was asleep when carried to bed around 10 o'clock, that nothing unusual occurred until the ransom note was discovered around 5:30 in the morning, that she was found in the basement shortly before 1 in the afternoon, then rigor development should align with that sequence. But if the rigor documented at discovery suggested she had been lost significantly earlier than the official timeline would indicate, we have a problem. We have physical evidence contradicting the narrative. And this is where the forensic analysis becomes crucial, because unlike witness statements that can be shaped or refined or corrected over time, rigor mortis is objective. It develops according to biochemistry, not according to what anyone needs to be true. From a philosophical perspective, there's something profound about how the body continues to communicate truth even after the capacity for speech has ended. Rigor mortis is testimony that cannot be silenced, cannot be coached, cannot be made to align with a convenient story. It simply is a physical manifestation of time's passage recorded in locked muscle fibers and rigid joints. And for anyone attempting to control the narrative around what happened, this presents an insurmountable challenge. You can stage a scene, you can write a note, you can contaminate evidence, you can refuse to cooperate with investigators. But you cannot change when rigor began or how far it had progressed when the body was found. That evidence exists in the photographs, in the medical examiner's notes, in the measurements and observations that were recorded. It's permanent, unchangeable testimony to a timeline that may not match what was claimed. From a psychological standpoint, consider what it would mean to be in a house with someone who had been lost, watching as the body gradually stiffened over the course of hours. There's something visceral about rigor mortis, something that makes the finality of what has occurred impossible to deny. When someone has just passed, there can still be a kind of disbelief. They look as if they might simply be sleeping. But as rigor develops, as the body becomes rigid and cool and obviously no longer alive in any sense, that denial becomes harder to maintain. For parents who discovered that one child had taken the life of another, the progression of rigor would have been a kind of torture, each hour marking another stage in the irreversibility of what had happened. And if they were using those hours to stage a scene, to create a narrative that might protect their surviving child, they would have been working in the shadow of that increasing rigidity, racing against a clock that kept its own time, regardless of their needs. So we circle back to the question that refuses to remain silent. What did the rigor development actually indicate about timing? We've examined the principles, the predictable progression, the stages of onset and resolution, the factors that can accelerate or slow the process. Now, we need to apply those principles to what was documented. If she showed full rigor throughout her body when found, biochemistry tells us she had been gone for approximately 8 to 12 hours minimum. If rigor was just beginning, localized to the jaw and upper body, we're looking at perhaps 2 to 6 hours. And if rigor had begun to resolve, if some joints were starting to become flexible again while others remained stiff, we're looking at more than 24 hours, which would be impossible given the timeline presented. The body's stiffness, measured and documented on that day, created a window. And that window either supports the reported timeline or it contradicts it. That determination, based on objective biological processes, remains one of the most significant pieces of evidence in understanding what actually happened during those hours between darkness and dawn. Theme 2. The variables. When the clock speeds up or slows down. We've established the typical progression of rigor mortis, but now we need to confront something that complicates our timeline calculations. The biological clock doesn't always tick at exactly the same rate. From a physiological perspective, several factors can accelerate or delay the onset and progression of rigidity. Temperature is perhaps the most significant variable. Cold slows everything down, while warmth speeds the process up. The muscular activity immediately before the event matters too. Someone who was struggling, fighting, experiencing terror that flooded their system with adrenaline would develop rigor more quickly than someone who passed quietly in sleep. The person's physical condition, whether they were thin or had more body mass, whether they were healthy or ill, whether they had any metabolic conditions, all of these factors influence the rate at which ATP is depleted and muscles lock. And this is where the timeline becomes more complex, because we're not just calculating backward from a fixed point. We're calculating through a range of possibilities. Let's think about the specific circumstances of that night from a forensic perspective. It was December in Colorado. Cold. The basement where she was found would have been significantly cooler than the main living areas of the house. Cold temperatures slow the chemical processes that drive rigor development. In an unheated basement in winter, rigor might take longer to reach full development than it would in a warm room. But here's where we need to be careful in our analysis. While the cold might have slowed rigor onset, it would have been working on a body that had likely experienced significant physiological stress in its final moments. If she was afraid, if she was struggling, if she experienced the kind of terror that causes the heart to race and muscles to tense, that pre-mortem activity would have depleted ATP more rapidly, causing rigor to begin sooner than it otherwise might have. These two factors, cold environment and pre-mortem stress, work in opposite directions, making the timeline calculation more nuanced than simple textbook progression would suggest. From a criminal psychology perspective, understanding these variables matters because they affect what someone staging a scene might have anticipated. If the people involved had some knowledge of how rigor develops, whether from reading, from previous experience with loss in their families, or simply from general cultural knowledge, they might have made certain assumptions about timing. They might have believed that the cold basement would slow rigor development enough to support whatever timeline they were constructing, or conversely, they might not have considered rigor at all, focused instead on other aspects of the scene they were creating. The degree to which they understood or failed to understand these biological processes tells us something about the sophistication of their staging, about whether this was carefully planned or desperately improvised, about whether they thought through the forensic implications, or simply reacted in panic to an impossible situation. Now let's consider this from an anthropological angle, because different cultures and different historical periods have understood rigor mortis differently. In some traditions, the stiffening of the body is seen as the spirit's final departure. In others, it's simply understood as a natural process that occurs in the hours after someone has passed. But across nearly all cultures, there's awareness that this stiffening happens, and that it happens on a schedule. Modern forensic science has simply codified and systematized what humans have observed for millennia. So when we think about adults in that house, educated people who would have had access to information about post-mortem processes, either through reading, through television crime dramas, or through life experience, we have to consider what they might have known about rigor and how that knowledge might have influenced their actions during those hours between the event and the discovery. From a logical standpoint, the variables that affect rigor progression create what we might call a range of reasonable timelines rather than a single precise timestamp. Medical examiners, when they assess rigor development, don't typically say, "This person died exactly 8 hours ago." Instead, they provide a window. Based on the degree of rigor present and accounting for environmental factors and the individual's physical characteristics, the post-mortem interval is estimated to be between 6 and 12 hours. This range is useful for investigators, but it also creates ambiguity that can be exploited in constructing alternative explanations. If the rigor development could reasonably support several different timelines, then establishing exactly when the event occurred becomes more difficult. And in a case where the timeline itself is contested, where different witnesses provide different accounts, that ambiguity becomes significant. Let's shift to the philosophical implications of this variability. We want evidence to be absolute, to speak with perfect clarity and remove all doubt. But biological processes, while they follow consistent patterns, are subject to individual variation. Two people who passed at exactly the same time under slightly different circumstances might show different rates of rigor development. This doesn't mean the evidence is unreliable. It simply means we must interpret it with appropriate scientific humility, acknowledging the range rather than seeking false precision. And yet, even with this acknowledgement of variability, there are limits. Even accounting for cold temperature, for individual differences, for all the factors that might have influenced the rate of progression, rigor development can only be accelerated or delayed so much. It cannot be off by many hours. The body's biochemistry has boundaries within which it operates. So when we look at the rigor documented in this case and work backward through all possible variables, we arrive at a window, and that window either encompasses the reported timeline or it doesn't. From a psychological perspective, uncertainty about timing can be both burden and shield for those involved. If they know that rigor progression varies, that environmental factors complicate the calculation. They might take comfort in the ambiguity, believing that the imprecision in timing creates reasonable doubt about when exactly she was lost. But that same uncertainty also means they couldn't be confident about what the medical examiner would determine. They were staging a scene with incomplete knowledge of how the biological evidence would be interpreted, making decisions about timing based on guesses about processes they may not have fully understood. And this creates a particular kind of anxiety, the awareness that the body itself was continuing to develop evidence that might eventually contradict the narrative they were constructing, but without knowing precisely what that evidence would reveal. So, when we think about the variables that affect rigor mortis progression, temperature, pre-mortem activity, individual physiology, environmental conditions, we're thinking about factors that create a range rather than a point, a window rather than a moment. From every analytical perspective, logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and criminological. These variables complicate our timeline, but they don't erase it. The range exists with upper and lower bounds determined by biochemistry and physics. The rigor documented when she was found had to have begun within a calculable window before that documentation occurred, and that window, even with all its variables and uncertainties, tells us something critical about what could have happened and what couldn't have. It creates boundaries within which the truth must lie, limits that no amount of staging or storytelling can overcome. The body kept its own time within its own parameters, and that time, variable but not infinitely malleable, remains one of our most reliable guides to understanding when the events of that night actually unfolded. Theme 3. The Witnesses to Time, cross-referencing the body's clock. We've examined rigor mortis as a biological timekeeper. We've considered the variables that affect its progression, and now we need to do what investigators do: cross-reference. We need to place the timeline suggested by rigor development alongside other evidence, the witness statements, the neighbor who reported hearing a scream, the pineapple evidence suggesting she was awake and moving through the house, the lividity patterns we've already discussed. From a forensic perspective, no single piece of timing evidence exists in isolation. Each marker, rigor, lividity, body temperature, stomach contents, witness accounts, provides its own estimate of when the critical events occurred. And when these estimates align, when multiple independent timekeepers point to the same window, we can have confidence in that timeline. But when they diverge, when one marker suggests one time and another suggests something different, we have to ask ourselves which evidence is most reliable and why the discrepancies exist. Let's start with the most straightforward cross-reference: rigor mortis and lividity development. These two processes occur simultaneously but independently, each following its own biochemical pathway. From a physiological standpoint, we can use both together to narrow the post-mortem interval more precisely than either would allow alone. If rigor suggests she had been gone for 8 to 12 hours and lividity suggests a similar time frame, we have corroboration. If one suggests a longer interval than the other, we need to understand why. Perhaps environmental factors affected one process more than the other. Perhaps there are individual physiological factors we're not accounting for. But when both processes, assessed independently, point to roughly the same window, the confidence in that timeline increases exponentially. These aren't witnesses who might have misremembered or who might have reasons to shade the truth. These are biological processes that operated according to chemistry and physics, creating overlapping testimony about when circulation ceased. Now let's consider the witness statements from that night. From a criminological perspective, human memory is notoriously unreliable, particularly in times of stress or trauma. But rigor mortis doesn't depend on memory. It simply develops. So when we have witnesses saying she was carried to bed asleep around 10 o'clock and seemed fine, but the rigor development suggests she had been gone for 10 or more hours before she was found just before 1 in the afternoon, we have a disconnect. Either the witnesses are incorrect about the timing of events, or the interpretation of the rigor is off, or the official timeline as presented has gaps that need to be explained. This is where investigators earn their keep, not by accepting any single piece of evidence as definitive, but by working through the contradictions until a coherent timeline emerges that accounts for all the physical evidence and makes sense of the human accounts. Let's think about the neighbor's report of the scream around midnight or shortly after. From an anthropological perspective, this account has particular weight because it comes from outside the house, from someone with no apparent motive to lie, no stake in the outcome beyond being a good citizen reporting what they heard. If that scream occurred between midnight and 1 in the morning, and if it represented a moment of extreme distress that might correlate with the events that took her life, then working forward from that time gives us a very specific window. If she was lost around that time, then by the time she was found shortly before 1 in the afternoon, roughly 12 to 13 hours later, we would expect to see full rigor mortis development throughout the body. The jaw, neck, upper body, lower body, extremities, all should show significant stiffness. If the documented rigor matches this expectation, we have multiple independent pieces of evidence pointing to the same timeline. If it doesn't, we need to understand why. From a psychological standpoint, there's something particularly revealing about how the official timeline evolved over the course of the investigation. Initial statements might differ from later ones. Details might be added or removed. Timings might be adjusted as people are confronted with evidence that contradicts their initial accounts. This is normal to some degree. Memory is reconstructive, and people genuinely remember things differently when prompted or when additional context is provided. But there's a limit to how much a timeline can shift before we start to question whether the changes reflect genuine memory correction or strategic adjustment to account for evidence that threatens the original narrative. Rigor mortis, again, doesn't shift. It was what it was when documented. So if witness timelines changed in ways that brought them into closer alignment with what the Rigor evidence suggested, we might see that as witnesses correcting their initial recollections. But if the timelines shifted in ways that created more distance from what the biological evidence indicated, we have to ask ourselves what motivated those revisions. Let's consider the logical framework here. We have multiple clocks running simultaneously: the biological clock of rigor development, the biological clock of lividity, the reported timeline of human activity in the house, the external witness accounts from neighbors, the evidence of food consumption suggesting she was awake and moving. From a forensic perspective, the goal is to find the timeline that makes sense of all these data points simultaneously. Not the timeline that explains away the biological evidence to preserve the human accounts, and not the timeline that dismisses witness statements in favor of purely physical evidence, but the timeline that genuinely integrates everything we know. And here's where the investigation becomes not just about collecting facts, but about constructing a coherent narrative that accounts for all of them: the comfortable facts and the uncomfortable ones, the evidence that supports initial assumptions and the evidence that challenges them. From a philosophical perspective, we're confronting questions about truth and how we arrive at it. In an ideal world, all evidence would point in the same direction, creating a clear and unambiguous picture of what occurred. But we don't live in that world. Evidence is messy. Human memory is fallible. Biological processes vary. And the search for truth requires us to navigate through uncertainty and contradiction. What rigor mortis gives us is an anchor point, not perfectly precise, but grounded in objective biological processes that operated regardless of human intention. When we cross-reference that anchor point with other evidence, we're not looking for perfect alignment. We're looking for a pattern of convergence that suggests we're moving toward truth rather than away from it. We're looking for the places where multiple independent sources of information point to similar conclusions, and we're particularly attentive to the places where they diverge, because those divergences often tell us where the careful examination needs to focus. So, when we step back and look at the full picture, rigor development suggesting a particular postmortem interval, lividity patterns supporting that time frame, witness accounts that either align with or contradict that window, external reports that may pinpoint a critical moment in the timeline. What we're seeing is a complex tapestry of evidence. From every analytical perspective, logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and criminological. The cross-referencing of rigor mortis with other timing evidence creates a more complete understanding than any single marker could provide. The body's stiffness, measured and documented, becomes one thread in a larger pattern. That thread has particular weight because it's grounded in objective, biological processes, but it doesn't stand alone. It must be woven together with everything else we know, every other timekeeper that was operating during those hours. And when we do that weaving carefully, when we honestly account for all the evidence rather than selecting only what supports our preferred narrative, a picture emerges. That picture may not be comfortable. It may challenge what we were told or what we initially believed. But it has the quality of truth because it makes sense of all the evidence simultaneously. The biological clocks and the human accounts, the comfortable facts and the ones that create uncomfortable questions about what was happening in that house during the hours when rigor was silently, inexorably marking the passage of time. We've walked through the progression of rigor mortis, examined the variables that affect its development, and considered how this biological timekeeper cross-references with other evidence to narrow the window during which she was lost. What emerges is a timeline grounded not in what anyone said, but in what the body recorded through processes that cannot be manipulated or revised. The stiffening began when circulation ceased and continued according to biochemistry, creating a window that either aligns with the reported sequence of events or suggests something quite different occurred. Next time, we'll continue this examination, moving deeper into the evidence that whispers of hours unaccounted for, of activities that were never fully disclosed, of a timeline that may not be quite what we were told it was.